What if I told you that one of the most brutal and legendary wars in history wasn't started by kings or empires or even gold? What if the spark that ignited a storm of bloodshed across continents was a single prophecy? A prophecy whispered in shadows, passed through sermons and scriptures, cloaked in divine promise. A prophecy that convinced over 100,000 men, many of whom had never even seen a battlefield, that God himself demanded they march, kill, and die. They left their homes behind, their wives, their children, their fields unharvested, all for a vision, etched not in strategy or politics, but in the stars, in symbols, in the dreams of desperate men. This is the story of a prophecy so powerful. It made ordinary people believe they were part of a holy apocalypse. And the church? They didn't stop it. They fueled it. The year was 1095. Europe was fractured. Lords fought lords. The common people suffered under famine, disease, and endless local wars. The church was struggling to assert its dominance amid political chaos. And in the east, the Byzantine Empire was on the verge of collapse, under pressure from a rising Muslim power, the Seljuk Turks. And then, it came. Not a king, not an army, a sermon. Pope Urban II stood before the crowd at the Council of Clermont. His voice was thunder, his words carefully chosen, almost theatrical. He didn't simply ask for military aid. He told a story of Christians being tortured in Jerusalem, of holy sites defiled, of innocent pilgrims massacred. He promised that those who died in battle would have their sins washed away, not in confession, not in penance, in blood. But what most people didn't hear, what wasn't written into the official history, was what came before that speech. Rumors, visions, and prophecy. Long before Urban spoke, stories had already been circulating through monasteries and towns. Tales of a coming battle between light and darkness. That a final war in the Holy Land would signal the end of days, and that those who fought in it would be part of God's chosen army. In 1094, a monk in France claimed he had a vision of angels descending upon Jerusalem, holding swords of fire, calling upon Christians to march east. He wasn't the only one. In Italy, Germany, and even England, wandering preachers began speaking of celestial signs. Eclipses, comets, sudden droughts. Each event interpreted as divine warning. The stars, they said, had spoken, and the message was clear. The time of holy war had come. But here's the twist. These prophecies weren't spontaneous. They were cultivated. Monks wrote chronicles filled with selective scripture. Passages from Revelation, Daniel, Ezekiel, stitched together to paint a vivid narrative. That the end of the world would begin in Jerusalem. That a great Christian army would liberate the holy city and prepare the way for Christ's return. These messages were copied, preached, reinforced in art, sculpture, songs. They weren't just predicting the war, they were preparing it. And the church? They never discredited these visions. In fact, they allowed them to spread, because fear and hope, when combined with faith, are the most powerful tools of control. So when Pope Urban finally spoke in Clermont, his words landed on hearts already primed by prophecy. And then came Peter the Hermit, a ragged, wild-eyed preacher, barefoot and starving, who wandered the countryside with a wooden cross and a voice that shook the desperate. He claimed he had received a vision from Christ himself, telling him to lead the people to Jerusalem. And they followed him, tens of thousands, peasants, farmers, beggars, monks, armed with clubs, pitchforks, kitchen knives. They weren't soldiers. They were believers. They called themselves the army of God. But what followed wasn't divine victory. It was chaos. Before even reaching the Holy Land, they began to kill. Entire Jewish communities in the Rhineland were slaughtered by these so-called holy warriors. In Mainz, Speyer, Cologne, men, women, children were dragged from their homes and butchered in synagogues. They called it purifying the path to Jerusalem. The church? Some bishops tried to stop the massacres, but many more turned a blind eye, and some quietly approved, because the movement was growing, and nothing could stop it. When the official Crusader armies finally arrived in 1096 and began their march east, the line between prophecy and propaganda had vanished. Knights began carrying relics. Some claimed to have fragments of the true cross. Others swore visions guided their swords. At Antioch, a starving crusader named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a vision from Saint Andrew, who told him where to find the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side. He led the soldiers to a hidden spot and unearthed a rusty spearhead buried in the ground. And they believed him. The entire army rallied. They marched into battle against overwhelming Muslim forces and won. Miracle? Maybe. Or maybe they were so consumed by prophecy that belief alone became their weapon. But here's the part history buries deepest. Peter Bartholomew was later challenged. Some began to suspect he had faked the Holy Lance. So he agreed to prove himself. By walking through fire, a long trench of burning coals was prepared. Peter walked across it. Slowly, deliberately, his flesh burned. He died days later from the wounds. But by then, it no longer mattered. The prophecy had fulfilled its purpose. When the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, they were not the same men who left Europe. They were fanatics. They stormed the city with divine fury. What followed was a massacre so brutal that even contemporary Christian sources described rivers of blood. Muslims were slaughtered in mosques. Jews burned alive in synagogues. Even Eastern Christians, mistaken for enemies, were hacked to pieces. To the church, it was a miracle. To history, it was a genocide. But what made it possible was not just military strategy or papal command. It was the belief, rooted in prophecy, that they were not just fighting a war. They were fulfilling a divine script. That their hands were instruments of God. That every drop of blood they spilled was sacred. And that belief, that blind, unquestioning faith, was the most dangerous weapon of all. So ask yourself, was the prophecy real? Or was it engineered? Did angels truly speak to peasants in the night? Or were those voices planted by men who understood the power of myth? Because once people believe they are chosen, once they believe their violence is holy, they stop asking questions. They stop listening to reason. And they march to war, to slaughter, to Jerusalem, not because of kings, not because of borders, but because someone told them it was destiny. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of the First Crusade is not the blood that was spilled, but how easily people were led to spill it, not by force, but by faith. And the prophecy? It didn't die with the Crusades. It evolved, reborn across centuries, in different religions, different lands, different wars, because even now, thousands of years later, humanity still listens to whispers in the dark, hoping they're from heaven, but forgetting they could just as easily come from hell.